We're currently standing in the ruins of Fort Frontenac, where the city of Kingston, Ontario now stands. It was here, in June of 1687, that Jacques-René de Brisay de Denonville, then Governor-General of New France, gathered an army in preparation to wage war against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Denonville's invasion was meant as a surprise attack, one that would deliver a crippling blow to the Seneca, the westernmost Haudenosaunee nation. In the process, many other Haudenosaunee communities, particularly those living on the north shore of Lake Ontario, like the villages of Kenté and Ganneious, would be targeted by Denonville's army. To understand Denonville's motives for the attack, we need to understand the geopolitical landscape of northeastern North America in the late 17th century. The French and the Haudenosaunee had been at peace since 1667, when they signed a series of peace treaties. Since that time, however, both sides were eyeing each other with suspicion, for both aimed for commercial, political, and military dominance throughout the Upper Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the Mississippi Valley. The French watched with growing concern as Haudenosaunee war parties descended upon their allies and trade partners to the west, particularly the Illinois and Miami. For their part, the Haudenosaunee watched with concern as the French began expanding towards the Mississippi Valley. Conflict between the two seemed inevitable. In response to the Haudenosaunee continuously striking their Illinois and Miami allies in the west, the French planned a secret war against the Seneca, who were primarily responsible for sending raiding parties against New France's western allies. Before the invasion of the Seneca country even began, however, Denonville and his military officers would capture hundreds of Haudenosaunee men, women, and children from various communities along the north shore of Lake Ontario who did not even know they were at war with the French. Out of all the Haudenosaunee prisoners, 36 would later be transported down the St. Lawrence River to Quebec, where they were subsequently shipped to France and forced into servitude and slavery on King Louis XIV's Mediterranean galleys. The French king had explicitly ordered the governor to make a great number of Haudenosaunee galley slaves, even writing, quote, "Let him," meaning Denonville, "so manage during the continuation of this war as to make the greatest number of prisoners possible, as it is certain that these Indians, who are vigorous and accustomed to hardship, can serve usefully on board His Majesty's galleys." In the 17th century, the Haudenosaunee were composed of 5 separate nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. These nations had come together in a confederacy in the period prior to European arrival in North America. The self-designation of Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse, and this term is becoming more commonly used than older European-applied labels like Iroquois. The Haudenosaunee not only lived in multi-family bark longhouses, but they also likened their entire confederacy to a longhouse, metaphorically referring to the Seneca as keepers of the western door, the Mohawks as keepers of the eastern door, and the Onondaga as keepers of the central council fire. Leaders chosen by clan mothers from all 5 nations came together in a grand council at Onondaga to discuss all matters of common concern, especially issues that threatened the entire confederacy. Much of the 17th century was marked by warfare between the Haudenosaunee, the French, and their indigenous allies. This era of history is sometimes referred to as the Iroquois Wars or the Beaver Wars. Starting in the mid-1660s, the Haudenosaunee took advantage of a temporary peace with New France to establish 7 new communities on the north shore of Lake Ontario. Haudenosaunee, mostly from the Seneca, Cayuga, and Oneida nations, established these North Shore communities, which allowed them to access the rich, fur-bearing hinterlands north of Lake Ontario. Moreover, new trade opportunities with the French and the Anishinaabe of the Great Lakes and Ottawa Valley might have also compelled the Haudenosaunee to move north of Lake Ontario. On June 8, 1687, Governor Denonville confidently marched against the Haudenosaunee, writing at the start of the campaign, quote, "All my hope is to spoil and lay waste to their fields, and to this end we shall all apply ourselves. Perhaps we may be able to catch their women and children too." End quote. From the outset, Denonville had every intention to seize captives. His army mustered at Fort Frontenac. There, he ordered his soldiers to round up and imprison several Haudenosaunee families who resided in a village nearby the fort. Denonville then tasked Jean Perret, a French officer, to seize and bring back the populations of the neighboring Haudenosaunee villages of Kenté and Ganneious on the Bay of Quinte, a long, narrow, Z-shaped inlet on the northern shore of Lake Ontario. Because the villagers resisted removal, Jean Perret had to call for reinforcements. Denonville dispatched an additional 50 soldiers to hasten the expedition. Perret and the reinforcements succeeded in removing 18 men and many more women and children, 80 people in total from the Bay of Quinte. Throughout his military offensive, Governor Denonville ended up imprisoning 219 Haudenosaunee, 63 men, and 156 women and children. All accounts agree that the Haudenosaunee men, women, and children were held hostage in Fort Frontenac, that the men were tied to wooden stakes, unable to move or defend themselves from biting insects, that some of New France's indigenous allies tortured them, and that the Haudenosaunee prisoners sang their death songs at the top of their lungs, believing that the French intended to kill them. The ruins of Fort Frontenac, where the Haudenosaunee were imprisoned, are still visible in Kingston today. Denonville justified his actions by assuming that the North Shore Haudenosaunee communities might have warned the Seneca south of the lake of his intended attack if they were allowed to retain their freedom. We are now at the W.D. Jordan Rare Books and Special Collections in the Douglas Library at Queen's University. Brendan Edwards, who is the curator here, has set us up with a number of interesting items in the reading room, so let's go have a look at them now. So first we are going to examine an eyewitness account written by Louis Armand de la Hontan, a French officer in Denonville's army. He wrote about his travels and experiences in North America in his book, which he published in the early 18th century, titled Nouveau Voyage de Monsieur le Baron de la Hontan dans l'Amérique septentrionale. First, the Baron de la Hontan described the French attack on the Haudenosaunee villages in the Bay of Quinte. La Hontan wrote, and this is my own English translation, "There was no difficulty in seizing them, for they found themselves blocked in, captured, and bound at nightfall, when they least expected it. They were brought to Fort Frontenac, where they were tied in a row to stakes by the neck, hands, and feet. This tyranny made me shudder with compassion and horror." Second, the Baron de la Hontan paraphrases a conversation between himself and a Haudenosaunee captive from the village of Ganneious. In the conversation, the Haudenosaunee captive lamented the plight of his people. La Hontan writes, and I quote, "He told me how they had been surprised and how their elders had been massacred. I do not believe one could be penetrated with a more poignant grief than his, as he recalled to me all the services he had rendered during his lifetime to the French. At last, after having uttered many sobs and sighs, he lowered his head and remained silent." The Baron de la Hontan's account highlights both the violence of colonial warfare and the moral shock it provoked among some contemporaries, like the Baron de la Hontan, who was an eyewitness observer to these events. More importantly, his account preserves a rare glimpse of Haudenosaunee voices in the colonial archive. The Jordan preserves over 100,000 maps in their collections, and we are fortunate to have a few with us here today. All of these maps importantly show the locations of Cataraqui, Fort Frontenac, and the Haudenosaunee villages on the north shore of Lake Ontario. This first map clearly shows the Haudenosaunee villages on the north shore of Lake Ontario, including Kenté and Ganneious on the Bay of Quinte. It also marks the north shore as the domain of the Iroquois du Nord, or Northern Iroquois, essentially the Haudenosaunee who lived on the north shore of Lake Ontario. This is an Italian map printed in Venice in 1778, and it derives its information from French sources. It places Kenté, Ganneious, and Fort Frontenac on the map. Interestingly, by the time this map was printed, the information it contained was about 100 years out of date. Lastly, this French map, printed in 1757, does not show a Haudenosaunee presence on the north shore of Lake Ontario, only a French claim. Because it went by two names, Cataraqui and Fort Frontenac are depicted alongside each other. Another familiar site on this map is Les Mille Îles, or the Thousand Islands, a group of more than 1,800 islands in the St. Lawrence River, straddling the US-Canada border. This map is not in the Jordan, but we are looking at a digitized image from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Pierre Raffet, a Jesuit missionary to the Seneca in the 1670s, drew this map of Lake Ontario and the surrounding areas with particular emphasis on the five nations of the Haudenosaunee. This map is unusually oriented, with the south at the top, so we are currently looking at the north shore. Raffet's map presents Lake Ontario, also known as Lac Saint-Louis, with the surrounding area marked as territory belonging to the Haudenosaunee. We have now read about the French attacks on Kenté and Ganneious, but where exactly were these sites? To ground this history in the present landscape, let's go now to the Bay of Quinte. We are now standing on the shores of Hay Bay, near Napanee, Ontario. It seems that Ganneious was located somewhere on the north shore of this bay, possibly below a limestone ridge. A missionary priest named Louis Hennepin actually described journeying from Fort Frontenac to Ganneious in the winter of 1677. While the edge of the lake was frozen, I went out onto the ice with crampons attached to my shoes to an Iroquois village called Ganneious, toward Kenté, 9 leagues from the fort, with the Sieur de la Salle, whom I have mentioned. The Indians of the place offered us elk meat and porcupine to eat. Kenté was further to the west, and was situated at Smokes Point on Weller's Bay, at the foot of an important portage between the Bay of Quinte and Lake Ontario. Whereas no plaque exists for Ganneious, we have two for the Kenté region. This first plaque describes the Sulpician mission established at the Cayuga village of Kenté in 1668. It reads that in 1668, Claude Trouvé and François de Fénelon, Sulpician priests from France, established this mission to serve Iroquois Indians on the north shore of Lake Ontario. Kenté, the Cayuga village which had requested the missionaries, became the mission's center. Buildings were erected at this village, which was probably located in the Consacon area, and livestock was brought from Ville-Marie, Montreal. Under Abbé Trouvé's direction, various resident Sulpicians served the mission, but from 1675, their activities were largely confined to the village center. The mission was abandoned in 1680, and the Sulpicians redirected their efforts towards establishing a mission closer to Montreal at a place called La Montagne. So by the time Denonville attacked in the summer of 1687, the missionaries had been gone for 7 years already. When Sulpician missionaries Claude Trouvé and François de Fénelon arrived in the Bay of Quinte to establish the Kenté mission in 1668, here's how they described their reception among the Cayuga who lived there. On our arrival at Kenté, we were feasted as well as the Indians of the place could manage. It is true that the feast consisted only of pumpkins fried with fat, and like stews, which we enjoyed. The pumpkins are excellent in this country and cannot be compared with those of Europe. Indeed, one might say that it is unjust to call them pumpkins. They are of great variety of shapes, bearing hardly any resemblance to those of France. There are even some so hard that they must be opened with an axe when they are not cooked. They all have different names. The second plaque describes the Bay of Quinte carrying place, the site of a traditional portage route between the Bay of Quinte to the east and Lake Ontario to the west. Although the plaque makes no mention of it, the Haudenosaunee who lived at Kenté would have made important use of this portage as well. Scholars believe that the Haudenosaunee selected the sites of Ganneious and Kenté for their proximity to agriculturally productive lands. Their locations were also strategically selected to command the major thoroughfares and portages of the region, thereby controlling the movement of peoples and furs coming from the Ottawa Valley to Lake Ontario. Following Denonville's invasion, the Haudenosaunee abandoned the north shore of Lake Ontario. They would not call the Bay of Quinte home again for almost another 100 years, when, in 1784, following the American Revolutionary War, the Mohawks established themselves at Tyendinaga in the Bay of Quinte. On July 4th, 1687, Governor Denonville departed Fort Frontenac with an army composed of 2,000 combatants to cross Lake Ontario and invade the Seneca. But that's a story for another video. Thank you for watching.